Void Bastards, video demonetized, is a recently released FPS roguelike game made by Blue Manchu. From the moment the title screen loads up for you, you'll be instantly greeted with a wonderfully charming comic book aesthetic that colors the entire game, giving it a standout art style that mixes with the game's dark comedic tone that is almost entirely presented through the incredible voice acting skills of Kevin Brighting, a name that many of you might recognize as the narrator of the Stanley Parable, which is a game that you should all play immediately. The game's premise, though, is a fairly simple one. You play a criminal who has been rehydrated in order to scour the Sargasso Nebula's derelict ships for parts in order to craft the components needed to restore the FTL drive of your vessel, the Void Ark, and return home. The game's narrative is delivered through a very obviously comic book style set of paneling, where you'll come to learn the story and watch it progress. As for the gameplay itself, a good way to describe it would be to imagine a first-person FTL Bioshock mashup, which makes a lot of sense considering that Blue Manchu was made up of some of the ex-Irrational devs after the company was closed back in 2014. You play as a client, a criminal in the game's penal system. Your character is randomly assigned to you as the game begins, and each individual character will be different in that they have traits that confer either positive or negative aspects, or just apply quirks to their gameplay. For instance, your character might be very short, which makes it hard for you to see through windows, but allows you to run through vents very quickly. Perhaps you're colorblind, and so your screen will be black and white. Maybe you have bad peripheral vision, and you'll play the game with the corners and sides of your screen blackened. Maybe you're a smoker, and intermittently you will be coughing, which will alert enemies to your presence. One trait I found that my character had was overly formal, and enemies were not listed by their type, but instead by their last names. Traits in this game can be both good and bad, as I mentioned, and some are very useful, but some are admittedly downright aggravating. Like before, having no peripheral vision for a while was frustrating to play with, as like I was looking through a tunnel, and having my character scream, "Yahoo!" whenever I looted something, whenever I looted anything, really did start to grate on my nerves. Luckily, traits are not permanent, and you will almost certainly engage in a bit of gene therapy to remove traits you don't like and add ones that you'll find are much more useful. The client that you play, however, is very much mortal, and should your character die, a new client will be recruited to take their place and continue on with the mission. When you die, your character will keep their acquired gear and weapons and assembled upgrades. However, you will lose your in-game currency, merits, your ammo, your fuel, and your food. You are tasked with navigating the star map, which is essentially the board in which you move your ship around to gather resources to progress further into the game. Your scouting ship, the Steve, can only move to the right and cannot backtrack to the left, meaning you have to plan ahead the routes that you take through the star map to ensure you encounter the random goodies floating around that you need and the ships that have the resources you prefer. Each time you move a space on the star map, one fuel and one food is consumed. Running out of either of these is very bad, obviously, but not immediately game-ending. You shouldn't need too fancy of a game reviewer to tell you that running out of fuel and food is bad in space. Every turn, you could say, your character recovers a little health with the food they consume, meaning having large stocks of food essentially acts as health recovery resources in between forays onto ships, because otherwise health does not regenerate passively. Hazards litter the star map as well. Pirates can follow you onto vessels and attack you inside, void whales might try to consume your vessel, and squids will destroy locations as they come across them. Mines will take away chunks of your health as well, so on and so forth. There are also random resources also floating around that can be picked up if you fly to their spaces on the star map, as well as gene randomizers that give random traits, as well as warp zones that will take your ship to a random location on the star map. The majority of your time, though, will be spent inside of the small ships that you will land upon in order to salvage resources. These vessels will float through the Sargasso Nebula, and they will vary in their size, design, and resource allotment. Different ships will give you different kinds of goodies, and every ship and location in the game will have its own mixture of enemy types, toughness, and special conditions. As a welcome buffer to the randomization that comes with many roguelike games in the genre, all this information is told to the player to a reasonable degree before you choose to actually commit to a landing. You might not know exactly how many janitor enemies are on a ship, for instance, but you'll see that there are few, or many, or shed loads of them. Conditions of the ship are also viewable, meaning that you'll be able to tell what, essentially, level modifiers exist before you delve in. So perhaps there is an excess amount of particular hazards like fires or electrical wires. Perhaps the security system is disabled, or the power is out, or the enemies carry extra merits, the in-game currency. Maybe all of the baddies on the ship are extra tough, or maybe they're extra weak, or they have half health due to infighting. Maybe there's a hidden stash of goodies somewhere on board. These modifiers can make the ship much easier to explore, or much harder to explore, so knowing what you're getting into and weighing the risks becomes part of the experience. Some ships you explore are military-style vessels. Others are more luxury liners, or administration vessels, or medical frigates. The aesthetics differ between all of these kinds of ships, and their bonuses and resource distribution can usually be seen before you board them entirely. Medical ships will have healing stations, which are obviously very valuable, and military vessels might have torpedoes on them, which lets you blow up pirates and void whales if you encounter them on the star map. Perhaps they have warp keys that will allow you to select any location ahead of you on the star map and then make an instant beeline jump to it. And all in all, you'll spend time trying to access locations that have the resources you'll need and find most useful, depending on what you do and do not have stockpiled. Rooms of the ship, though, will begin to repeat and repeat. For the most part, I didn't mind so much myself because the variety is reasonable as it is, but you'll certainly come to know with intimate familiarity the layout and design of many ship sections that will simply be copies from other locations. Though the loot in them and enemies could shift, the layouts might be otherwise exactly the same as other places in terms of walls and doors and rooms. Aboard ships, there are different areas where utilities can be accessed. The helms of ships allows you to download the loot locations to your minimap, or you can pay merits to download the locations of enemies. Gene therapy stations can remove traits you don't like or add certain traits to your character. Garbage recyclers let you turn junk resources into merits. Workshops will upgrade your junk to more valuable versions. And oxygen rooms will replenish your oxygen supply. Break rooms will let you drink coffee or tea and get a huge damage and movement speed buff for a short time, etc., etc. There are more that I haven't mentioned yet, but ships have a number of useful features to them that you'll take advantage of when you can in order to power up your client or to make the most of the resources that you'll need. So sometimes when you board a ship, the power is out, so you'll have to trek to the generator room and restore power to the vessel before you can properly loot the ship or access its security systems and utilities. And almost all of these utilities can be authorized, or essentially bought out with merits, the in-game currency. Authorizing security turrets will turn them into allies and they'll fire at other baddies. Some loot is locked, and merits have to be spent to open them up. Authorizing oxygen stations will boost your maximum oxygen for the current excursion, and authorizing gene therapy stations will allow you to use them in extra time, etc., etc. You'll board vessels with 3 weapons of your choosing that you'll use to clear out the enemies. These can range from simple pistols to a staple-shooting shotgun, a fast-firing rivet gun, a laser you can charge up and fire through windows or that go through enemies. You'll have grenades and proximity mines, stun guns, mechanical exploding cats, force fields that reflect enemy attacks back at them, a warp gun that removes enemies from the ship but lets you reposition them wherever you want. You'll have cluster bombs, poison spike throwers. Ultimately, there's an impressive arsenal that you'll be able to create and upgrade as you play the game, and the way that weapons work really does remind me of BioShock and how creative you can get with what you're given. So for instance, the cluster bomb does incredibly high damage, but the fuse is long when you throw it, and it can be hard to properly time below enemies. So you can throw it at enemies and lock them behind doors to ensure that they get hit by the ensuing explosions. You can stun enemies with a stun gun and then hit them for easy headshots. You can reposition enemies onto traps or to map hazards. And the combat, essentially, while it's rather simple in terms of its mechanics, allows for creative ways to deal with sometimes really tough enemies or hordes of them. A valuable ability when health recovery isn't very readily available when you're actually in combat, and resources are lost when you play poorly or if your character perishes. Ammunition availability isn't scarce, nor is it excessive, since you'll most often be swapping between weapons depending on what enemies you'll fight. However, wasting ammunition or using it poorly to whittle down tougher enemies can very much lead to a situation where your gun runs dry. As for the enemies that you'll fight, it's important to note that killing enemies is not mandatory. You don't get experience or anything, and it's possible to sneak around them or to simply run away from them. They do often drop items upon death, but whether or not that's worth the expenditure or of resources, or risking the potential health loss through combat, that's up for the player to decide. Sneaking as a mechanic is reasonably done, but it's simple as well. Don't let enemies see you, and if they do, stay out of sight for a while and they'll eventually go on their merry way. Sprinting will alert enemies to your location, and you can get behind enemies if they don't know you're there for easy headshots or powerful blasts. Enemies are animated in 2D, giving them a comic book-like quality that I rather enjoyed watching as I played, and there weren't any moments where their 2D nature annoyed me or felt unfair. As they turn and move around, you'll see their model shift into one of 8 different directional designs, much like you would recognize from Doom games of old, where enemy sprites would change to show you their direction, front, back, side, or angled. Enemy types are varied in size and appearance and their attack abilities, so some enemies will explode when you get close, but that means you can use them as bombs to attack other nearby enemies with the friendly fire damage of the boom. Other enemies will use ranged attacks against you, which require a fair amount of skill to dodge since they will lead their targets. Some enemies shoot out bouncing projectiles in all directions. Some of them lay down mines, and some protect their front side with a shield, meaning you'll have to hit them from behind to the side with thrown grenades or sneak up on them. Security robots are almost ubiquitous to ships. Turrets will fire at you when they see you, but can be bought out with merits to attack other baddies instead. Security cameras will summon a very tough robot to fight you, and pirates can follow your ship and land in vessels to seek you out in combat as well. But all in all, every enemy feels like some sort of a comic book villain or street thug or criminal type. They have different voice lines, depending on what kind they are, and they vary in appearance to give the impression of variety. And further detail given to the comic book style of the game, when enemies are nearby or in adjacent rooms, the literal onomatopoeia of their movements can be seen in doorways, just like the words kaboom are seen after explosions. Both of these give Void Bastards its charming, cartoonish quality look that sets it apart from other games. The gameplay loop is all about navigating the star map, landing on ships, looting them for resources, crafting parts with those resources in the workbench, powering up your character, and pressing onwards. Many will find the gameplay loop satisfying, but it's fair to say that for another many, eventually the repetition might grow stale. A playthrough of the game took me about 9 hours to complete on the normal difficulty, but other difficulty levels exist that will certainly have me revisiting the game in the future, since I certainly find a level of quality and variety in the ships and their modifiers and the desire to make my arsenal even more deadly as I proceed. Void Bastards is a game I would certainly recommend for those seeking to play a uniquely stylized roguelike focused around constant quick looting, crafting and upgrading, and enjoying simple, consistent combat that allows for player creativity.